Alrighty, we're finally here. We're doing an inequality with a fraction. Okay, so again, still going through the same steps. We want a 0 on our right hand side. We have one, so we can put our box. And then we need to determine whether our function or our box is positive or negative. It is less than 0, so this is going to be negative, okay? Once you've established whether it's negative or positive, we are allowed to change it, our inequality, to an equal sign. So I'm going to do that. And we know how to solve this from our last section, or maybe a couple of sections before, actually. Yep, so if you need a refresher on that, go back to section 3.4, and we talked about how to solve equations with fractions, okay? So, yeah, whenever you're working with these, there's multiple ways to go about it. The easiest way for this one, because we have a fraction and it's equal to 0, we actually talked about this a little bit during test 1. This was a test question, a similar test question, but when we were talking about domain. But whenever you have a fraction, what would make the fraction 0 if there's a 0 on the top or a 0 on the bottom? A 0 on the top, right? If there's a 0 on the bottom, that means it's undefined. So essentially, whenever you have a fraction equal to 0, you're really just setting the top equal to 0. One thing that you do have to know about these problems, though, you are going to have to label whatever the whatever critical value that causes your function to be undefined as part of your one of your critical values. So essentially, we're going to set our bottom. We know that our bottom is not allowed to be 0, right? It's not allowed to be 0, because if it was 0, we would get undefined. And we know that our top is supposed to be 0 because that's what we're asking our function to be, right? Equal to 0. So we're going to solve both of these. So essentially here, your x and 3 are connected by multiplication. To reverse multiplication, divide. So we have x is equal to 3. Okay? And then over here, we have x does not equal negative 6. Okay? So these are both going to be a part of our critical values. Okay? So now, when we're doing these, we can only graph these using way 2. Well, I'm not going to say only. Maybe there's another way how to do it. I don't know how to do it, but essentially, we are only going to, am only going to use way 2 to graph these. So we have negative 6, and we have our 0 for our critical values. And essentially, we need to check between each of these intervals and determine whether it's positive or negative. And then remember, we only want the negative values, okay? So we plug these into the box, okay? The box only shows up when there's a 0 on the right-hand side. So if I pick numbers between each of these, here I'll use negative 1, here I'll use positive 1, and here I'll use negative 7, okay? So if I take this 1 and I plug it in here, all this is going to give us a positive. And again, you can use your calculator and do 3 answer divided by answer plus 3, and then do our little fancy trick where it works really fast, okay? So we get a positive, we plug in negative 1, we'll get a negative 3 on top, and then a positive on the bottom, but negative divided by a positive is going to give us a negative. Then we plug in our negative 7, we'll get a negative on the top and a negative on the bottom, and negative divided by negative is going to give us a positive. Okay, and we only want the negative answers because our box is less than 0. So we're only taking from here to here, okay? So one thing that I would like to note here, whenever you're working with the part that is undefined, this is always going to be parentheses, right? Because it cannot equal 0. And remember that not equal to sign goes with parentheses. So for our 6, we definitely are going to have parentheses. And then for our 0, it's going to be based off of our inequality sign, which is also parentheses, but just for this example. But let's just say, let me just toss up a different color real quick. Let's just say that there was a line here. That means that this would become a bracket. Does that make sense? But this would still stay a parentheses, because it has to be a parentheses because we have a not equal sign. So if this is what the problem looked like, this would be the answer. But because there isn't a line, we will use a parentheses here, okay? And this would be our final answer.